Welcome back again to Advancing with Watercolor, and I'm building on a series of works that we're doing in the plein air outdoors in the Boston area over the summer. My class is meeting on Wednesday and Thursday morning to paint in places like the North End, the Southwest Corridor, near South Station, and so on. Today we're back in Paul Revere Mall, looking the opposite direction towards the old South Church, Old North Church. Sorry, I'm not sure. Anyway, our particular motif is the fountain that is in the middle of the mall. You can see a picture of it here. This is not the exact angle that I'm working from, but it's close enough to give us information that we need for comparison. And if you remember the previous video, I was building a dark motif against a lighter background. Here I'm doing the opposite. I'm going to build a light motif against a dark background. And this is a little more difficult technically than painting dark on top of light. The reason being, we have to cut around so many shapes, and that slows down our work so that things begin to dry perhaps a little faster than we'd like, and we get some accidentals, and we have to be a little more precise with the hard edges that we create. You see me now painting on top of the drawing a little bit of the lighter tones to the figures. This is just to remind me where to stop the brush so that I don't accidentally lop off a head or an arm or a piece of the fountain that is important. I need to see some of these edges when I start to build the second stage or the darker stage. But preceding all of this is an underpainting of the lighter hues or the lighter colors that are moving behind or through the shadows, or actually rising above the shadows and giving us a feeling of light striking foliage or edges on the fountain or figures or whatever. And this underpainting is done very quickly with a big brush, trying to get a variety of green in the foliage that surrounds the fountain, going a little bluer on the right side, a little more yellow on the left side. This helps to create a feeling of the light moving across the scene, which we'll build on. A little chevron of blue coming down from above, dividing the trees, giving us a feeling of the mall. And in the distance there was a steeple for the church, but I'm neglecting that. I'm focusing more on the fountain, zooming in quite a bit from the image which you saw, and giving the fountain strong placement in the painting, a little off-center, a bright shape so that I can build the painting in accordance with a light on top of a dark, or behind a light, a strong dark. And that strong dark is what's creating the feeling of the intensity of the light, the low morning light, which is striking a figure, striking the fountain. This very much figured into my thoughts as I was deciding what to paint and how to paint it. As I said in the earlier video, one of my first concerns is am I going to show my subject as a light against a dark, which is the case today, or in the previous painting as a dark against a light. Now this may seem sort of absurdly simple, light against dark, dark against light, but in fact this simplicity really helps you a lot. We can always complicate that. We can always make subtle adjustments and make it less obvious, more subtle, more interesting. But it starts from this idea. You can see it here, the light area against all those light midtones, and it's going to be amplified. The light is going to be strengthened as I create this pattern of shadows, which I'm starting to develop now, giving the trees some form, giving the angle of light some strength, making the light areas pop off of the page. This is the goal as I'm building up this darker wash. Using a big brush, holding it by the back, trying to make the brushwork more descriptive, more calligraphic, more energetic. I'm really working hard to control it, but at the same time I want there to be sort of a free expression, a sort of joy in using the brush, which I always feel. You can see in the return of this image that the shadow play in the trees is quite strong. The contrast behind the figures is quite strong, and that's something that I'm trying to preserve and express and even amplify. Just as in the previous painting, I subdued the background, made it much lighter than it would appear. Here I'm trying to amplify it, perhaps make it a bit darker, more dramatic, more hard edges, more angled brushwork, which means energy in itself. When we use obliques in our brushwork, it creates a very high energy in the painting. So I'm using these things to build up the shadows in the background. As I bring down the right-hand side, I have to be very careful. Remember, we're cutting around shapes, slowing down. You saw me switch to that small brush because I need to preserve the shapes of the figures at the fountain. I need to create some additional figures behind the fountain. I need to shape the fountain itself. So when I work on the lower part of that wash that's defining areas, I make that switch to smaller brush. What we're doing now is we've switched over to the left-hand side of the painting, still working with that deep violet mid-tone, using a lot of ultramarine blue, a little bit of neutral tint, a little bit of alizarin crimson. And I don't flavor them. I vary the combination of colors slightly as I go back and add color. So on the right-hand side, there's going to be a little more blue. On the left-hand side, a little more red. This variation creates, well, it always creates interest in our painting, doesn't it? It makes passages which might look a little oversimplified more varied and more interesting. So as you're working with a large wash as we are here, you see me going quite blue now. Same tone, same darkness, but much more blue in this shadow that's falling on the fountain. So as I'm building up this dark, rich value, which is describing the light, I'm always trying to think of ways to vary it. A little redder here, a little bluer here, a little more neutral tint or burnt sienna. Any sort of variation, as long as we're staying in the tonal range, is going to make a big wash more interesting. Also, we can grade it. By grading it, I mean go from a lighter aspect to a darker aspect, which is what I'm trying to do in this passage, where I want it just a bit lighter at the top, maybe a little darker towards the bottom to get a feeling of a warm shadow, but at the same time some luminosity, so that it's not just a flat application. There should be some change in that big shadow. So I'm trying to do that in all of these shadows. Well, look at how this fountain is just glowing now. We're going to push back against the bowl of the fountain and cast some shadows on it, but this is the primary structure that I'm after, and a light against a dark. The light area is smaller, more intense, some light tones in the foliage, sky, and foreground, some really rich darks weaving behind the subject, making the edges of the subject jump off the paper and grab our eyes. We feel an intensity to the light as we see it now, which I would like to preserve. starting to add some more figures to the back here, just to create interest. I've got my major figures are leaning against the fountain, the couple and their two children. There's a minor figure to the right with another child, and then some figures walking through the shadows, which are important, but definitely they're not the main figures. These are more like what you would see in a theater production, a chorus, a crowd of figures that populate the scene and make it feel busy and crowded and lively. But in terms of a focal point, it's more the figures that are leaning against the fountain and casting shadows. Well, the painting has already assumed a sort of finished quality. What remains for me to do, I feel, is to refine some of these light areas, add perhaps a bit more color to my major figures, populate the foreground with a figure or two. I'm still not sure what I want to do there. Add highlights, add a feeling of the pavement that moves through the scene. That'll make the shadows feel more transparent. But it's all sort of icing on the cake, if I think of it that way, because the cake, or the main part, is already here. It's already in front of us, and every stroke, everything that I add is going to be measured against the focal point. The focal point being the couple, especially her hat is really coming off in a positive way. I think I captured the playful nature of the children leaning over the fountain, and the watchful eye of the parents. A figure coming through the shadows, very close to us. Notice how the heads tend to align, giving us a feeling that we're on a flat surface. And the figure's coming very close to us, also a dog. Of course, it's that kind of area where you see families, where you see pets, where you see people from all walks of life coming out and sitting in the sun, enjoying a coffee, enjoying the paper, enjoying the violinist that's behind us. It's a very calm and serene area, and though the light is quite dramatic, I'm just trying to capture that sort of community aspect where everybody feels welcome and people are there to kind of regenerate their spirit or relax and renew themselves. For us, it was a positive morning because we had great weather. Boston hasn't been so kind this summer. We've been enduring a lot of wet weather, which for the person who likes to work outdoors is a little frustrating. In any case, we have a gorgeous day today, and we're making full use of it. I've returned with a little bit of the green that I used in the beginning to reshape the foliage, get some twists and turns to the foliage to make it perhaps a bit more interesting. And I'll just keep adding small touches at this point, very small touches. I'll put some accents in the shadows. I'll add some highlights to shoulders and heads. I'll add a bit of local color to the figure that's walking through the scene. I'll add pavers, all sorts of little touches at this point to refine the image. The main thing I'd like you to take away from actually the series is how important it is to make a decision in the beginning of your work whether you're going to focus, whether you're going to build your painting based on a dark motif against a light area or a light motif against a dark area. Color is a variable that you can play with in any scenario. The light and dark is what gives us readability, and that readability, if used in the right area, can tell a story. It can express a dramatic light, as we're doing today. It can also express subtlety if the values are very close to each other. I would still think of it as a light against a dark or a dark against a light, but the subtlety in fashioning the lights and darks can can give a completely different mood and a different sensation than what we're creating today. A bit of white to give that feeling that water is cascading over the edge of the fountain. I am not opposed to using whites to recapture an edge that's been lost, or in this case, to express a movement of water. I placed a white and I drag my finger in a downward motion and I capture the feeling of water falling. So, and we're using the white of the paper. It works perfectly in harmony with that. So I have no qualms about adding a touch of white, opaque white. This is Holbein. It's carried in their transparent section. It's not gouache. It's opaque, but it's not in the gouache section. It's the titanium white from Holbein. I use that and the jaune brilliant, which has a bit of yellow to it. These colors really work well to regain a highlight. You notice I've given the dog a little red tongue, some highlights to the hat and shoulders of the figure that's closest to us, etc. They add a degree of detail that makes the overhead light so much stronger. Well, this has been a good series because I was able to talk about the importance of light and dark and show you how it shapes my working thoughts. Whenever I'm in the field, actually whenever I'm doing a painting, one of the first decisions I make is how to use light and dark. This case was a high contrast. So I hope you've gotten something from the series. You can find more information about working with tonal values, working in Plein at my website, and you can find often if you read the description you'll find links to tutorials and other information that I think you'll find helpful.